Barry and Honey Sherman were found dead in their home in Toronto on December 15th, 2017.
The investigation continues into the shocking deaths of pharmaceutical billionaire and his wife.
It's pretty rare for people of this wealth to be murdered, and in fact, Barry and Honey Sherman were among the wealthiest people ever to be murdered. What we don't know is who did it. I wrote initially in 2018 a long story for Bloomberg Businessweek about this case. I'm from Toronto. I grew up in the Jewish community where the Shermans loomed very large. I was very vaguely acquainted with the family, so of course I was interested. The reason I came back to it was there was a lot of new information, and we now know a great deal more than we did in 2018. We still don't know the central answer of who done it. Who was responsible for this heinous crime. Barry was the founder and chairman of a company called Apotex, a very large generic pharmaceutical manufacturer that filled something like 1 in 5 prescriptions in the country. They were worth several $billion. They were also sort of ubiquitous, very well known. They were big philanthropists.
For decades, Honey and I have both felt the commitment to do what we could for the community. She does all the community service work. She's been chair of just about everything. And my time is better spent doing what I can to try to earn money so I can write the checks.
Fair and equitable.
Fair and equitable.
The Shermans, despite being extremely wealthy, lived very modest lives. They flew economy. Barry drove a series of kind of rattling cars. They would open the door for anyone who knocked. They did not live in fear, and frankly, they had no reason to, until, of course, they did.
Shocking news. The founder of Canadian drug giant Apotex, Barry Sherman, and his wife Honey have been found dead in their York Mills mansion.
The circumstances of their death appear suspicious.
The manner in which they were found was bizarre. They were found in their basement where they had an indoor swimming pool. Their bodies held up by belts that had been wrapped around their necks. So a pretty gruesome scene, as you can imagine.
Forensic officers combed the billionaire's home looking for something, anything that may determine who killed Barry Sherman and his wife Honey.
The day the bodies were found, there were quite a few people in their house. There was a housekeeper, there was a gardener, a personal trainer, and there was also a real estate agent who was showing their house to potential buyers. They go through the whole house, it's a big place, I believe 12,000 square feet. And toward the end of the tour, they get into the basement. She walks into the pool room and sees in the sort of dim light her clients, Barry and Honey Sherman, on the pool deck, sort of slumped and attached to the railing with these leather belts. And it's clear to everyone that they're dead. The police were treating this as a possible murder-suicide.
We are not currently seeking or looking for an outstanding suspect.
The idea being that Barry Sherman had killed his wife and then killed himself. And that, from the start, struck a lot of people close to the Shermans as very odd. There's just physically, it was very hard to imagine. Barry was not in great shape. He was not a strong guy. The people who were really most upset by this, understandably, were the Shermans' 4 adult children. And they were concerned that the police were heading down the wrong path. So they commissioned a private investigation. First priority was getting a second autopsy done, and that found forensic evidence. Strongly suggested that this was, in fact, a double homicide.
New details this hour on the deaths of Toronto billionaires Barry and Honey Sherman.
There were markings on Barry Sherman's wrists, which seemed to indicate that his hands had been bound at some point. There were actually 2 sets of marks on the Shermans' necks. So obviously there's a mark from the belt. But there was also another marking, a narrower one, and that looked like it could have been from a cord or a rope. But That wasn't found at the scene. So the implication, of course, being that they were strangled and then moved. The private team reported their findings to the police immediately.
It became clear that they were both murdered, and the Toronto Police Service should not have drawn any conclusion which suggested self-inflicted injuries.
However, it takes about a month for the police to actually meet with the pathologist who the private team had hired. A couple of days later, the senior officer gives a press conference.
We believe now we have sufficient evidence to describe this as a double homicide investigation, and that both Honey and Barry Sherman were in fact targeted.
There were tons of people who were speculated as suspects. For example, Barry Sherman's cousin, Carrie Winter, who was engaged in a really acrimonious legal battle with Sherman.
He cared about one thing: money, making lots of it, and not caring who he destroyed.
And in fact, a judge threw out the claim in September of 2017, so not long before the murders. This timing was suspicious to everyone.
I was betrayed. My cousin hurt me, and now I want to hurt him.
As you can imagine, this got the police pretty interested in him, but there was just no evidence tying him to the crime. There are the Shermans' children who inherited the entire fortune. They became, at a stroke, billionaires. So of the 4 kids, there are 3 girls, 1 boy. The boy is Jonathan Sherman, who was the most business-focused, and he would take a key role in managing these assets, which the kids had just inherited.
This has been so incredibly painful and so bizarrely surreal. My sisters and I pledged to rise again and to continue thriving, and knowing, as our parents always reminded us, that with great privilege comes enormous responsibility.
As the Sherman's children took over the empire, things began to change pretty quickly. At the time of his death, Sherman was very focused on expansion. The children, however, wanted to slow down investments, to back off on expansion, and essentially to get the business ready to sell. And in 2022, they agreed to sell to a private equity firm called SK Capital. And certainly his colleagues have told me that Barry Sherman would have been horrified by this. But of course, he's not around to make that decision. Sherman was very unusual in a lot of ways. He loved kind of backing people. The person he funded most lavishly was Frank D'Angelo. He and Sherman were initially in the beer business together. Frank is kind of a comic figure. He had a low-budget talk show. He produces B movies, with titles like Sicilian Vampire, which Sherman funded.
Can I trust you? Because if I can't trust you, I have to come back and kill you.
And the people around him thought this was completely bizarre. They could not understand why he would keep advancing him tons and tons of money. That was just one of these very odd financial entanglements that, as the police and private investigators dug into Sherman's affairs, they had to wade through. The other big area that was worth looking into was competitors. Sherman had made a lot of enemies in the pharmaceutical world over the years. He had himself speculated that one day a rival pharmaceutical company might have him killed. And all of this was done, but none of it has led to arrests, let alone a prosecution. After really not saying anything publicly for about 2 years, they released video of the walking man.
We seized a very large amount of security video footage. We are left with one individual whom we have been unable to identify. The timing of this individual's appearance is in line with when we believe the murders took place. Based on this evidence, we're classifying this individual as a suspect.
Why did it take you 4 years to release this video?
We undertook these investigative steps to identify this individual, and now having gotten to the point where we have not been able to do so, this is now the prudent time to release this to the public and seek the public's assistance.
We don't know if releasing this footage earlier would have had some benefit. It is striking that the police were in possession of this footage in 2018. We're dealing with an intensely secretive law enforcement culture. The default is to say nothing, and that is largely what has happened in this case. Who would have a motive to kill both Barry and his wife? You could imagine, for example, in some business dispute that had gone horribly wrong, he might be a target, but why also target her? The other thing that I think really has been very confusing for a lot of people who've looked at this is the method. You would think, a bullet does the job perfectly well, but no, they were strangled, which is painful, intimate, not what you would imagine, for example, a hitman employing. We are 5 years on now, and there have been no arrests, let alone any charges. The whodunit, the central mystery here remains completely unsolved.